I try to connect my short and long episodes in some way each week, so seeing as how Thursday's episode is all about shopping malls, I figured a source that comes from the early 2000s, the last hurrah for mall culture, made sense. This is the EPS podcast, and this is short number 14 for season 2. Skylor, my on-the-spot guest last month at Defiant Records and Craft Beer in Laconia, New Hampshire, dove into the business's extensive stacks of vinyl and selected a record from turn-of-the-century rockers Taking Back Sunday. It's fascinating to see an album of songs that were probably first listened to on CDs, which were on their way out 20 years ago, as well as MP3s, which were on their way in, on vinyl record, one of the original formats for recorded sound. All right, so we're back on. Here I am at Defiant Records in Iron Maiden is being shown to me. Have a nice night. It was great. Defiant Records and Craft Beer in Laconia, New Hampshire, and this is the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I am Eric Paul, and I am sitting down here with Skylor.
Yes, correct, Skylor.
And this is probably the last thing you thought you'd be doing when you woke up this morning, right?
That is an accurate statement.
I get that a lot because when I've shown up at different places, they're like, what? Podcast? Okay, I guess I'll do it. So I was successful in coaxing you to do this with me, and I really appreciate that. That means a lot to me.
Of course.
And as a token of my appreciation, I said, go ahead and choose something I know nothing about, and we'll test my skills and abilities. So the person of dissection and seeing what it tells me about stuff. So what we do is use pop culture as a way to say, what does it tell us about the time period in which it was made? So what did you choose to talk about tonight?
So I chose to talk about Taking Back Sunday.
Is that the name of the album, or do they have their?
That's the name of the band.
Okay.
Yep, and the album is Tell All Your Friends 20th Anniversary Edition.
So this means that it's at least 20 years old, right?
Correct.
And isn't it wild that so are we talking early 2000s?
I would say so.
Okay.
Definitely.
Isn't it wild that we are, for the longest time, I was like, okay, anything with 20 in front of it is, just the other day, but I'm like 20 years ago is the early 2000s. It was like a different world back then, wasn't it?
That was a long time ago, and I was pretty young at that time.
So, I think about groups that were coming out in that time period, a lot of different kinds of rock music. It wasn't just as straightforward as, it maybe was before that, trying new things. Is this one of those groups that had very long names for their songs? I'm thinking of like Breaking Benjamin, and are those their peers, or like Fall Out Boy, or is there...
So not super long, but the names make absolutely no sense with the songs. So... For example, Cute Without the E. There's nothing in the song that says anything about cute without the E.
That's so funny, because just moments ago we were, myself and my previous guest were talking about Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited, and that came out in 1965. Very similar. Just the title of that album is not exactly telling you anything. It's not as clear cut, and a lot of the song titles, same thing. It's just kind of like ambiguous, not really sure what it is. So, in fact, because this is a 20th anniversary edition, it's almost two time periods in one, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd
because
say so.
We're looking at 20 years ago and then present day. Why would they reissue this?
Yeah.
But the question I have for you is, who is the intended audience or user of this? Tell me a little bit about the group Taking Back Sunday.
Yeah, so, I remember being in middle school, high school, and just having these songs. So I have an older sister that is 4 years older than me, and this was like her kind of music. So really, I was introduced to it through my older sibling who listened to this all the time. I remember playing PlayStation and having Taking Back Sunday playing in the background.
You just brought me back.
I know. And so I would say this is more directed towards like, what's a good...
Millennial, Zoomers,
I would say millennials, but more like rock. So it's not so much like the pop that you hear or that you heard. It's more of like a different a different kind of vibe that you get from Taking Back Sunday.
Is it did you ever get to see them live, or like?
I did not get to see them live, but I think that they were just at When You Were Young, in the concert that was in Las Vegas for all of the punk old time music that happened recently, that Kristen, the owner of Defiant, was actually at over the last
really?
weekend.
Okay.
Yes. So if I remember correctly, I think they were one of the bands that was performing at that.
So is that sort of their background, their roots would be like a punk scene that they?
I would definitely say so, and very much just like a lot of emotions in the songs that just as like a young kid dealing with a bunch of different things, you kind of just like feel everything they're saying, and like I said, it doesn't really make sense, like none of the names make sense. But
is that the same generation of like Yellow Card and Sum 41?
I would say
that
100%.
kind of version of
or like Panic at the Disco. I remember listening to Panic at the Disco.
That was
at
the group
time.
that I was thinking of that had like endless names for their songs and kind of weird aesthetics and videos and stuff that I was like, so I grew up on, like I guess 90s punk would be where I got my like Green Day and Rancid and NoFX and Offspring and like that whole Berkeley scene, Oakland scene from California, like got me started. And then I went back to the 70s, 80s stuff, and I'm wearing a Misfits shirt right now, so I got like into that. And I remember when the millennium came and went, and these kind of groups started showing up, and they were being labeled, along with Avril Lavigne, as punk.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, that's not punk. I'm like, punk's supposed to be like this. And then I thought about it. I'm like, well, who am I to say? I don't own music,
punk.
Or that title, or anything like that. And I was just talking with Bob a few minutes ago about this, and how punk just is kind of like an updated version of folk. It's just music of the people. It's not anything like that. So you're mentioning that they really spoke to the youth of that early 2000s.
And it's interesting whenever you think back at like the songs and stuff, and you're like a high schooler, a freshman in high school that is like singing along with these songs that you're like, oh, I totally feel this. And then looking back, it's like one of the songs, You're So Last Summer, it talks about how boys like you are a dime a dozen, and it's like, what did I know about that in high school or middle school?
but they were at least a little bit older, right? Like they weren't that age. They were in their 20s, probably 30s or so. And it must say something about the group that they were able to kind of put themselves into that mindset to appeal to a younger audience.
Absolutely.
And know what they're going through, because early 2000s kids were going through a lot of different things than even those of us who grew up in the 90s.
100%.
The internet, I know we always kind of go back to that as like, nowadays everything's blamed on COVID, but everything's blamed on or pointed like the internet changed, but it did change everything.
Yep.
And it wasn't really until, would you say that came out like 2002, 2003, around there?
I would say probably so.
That the internet was really getting its footing as like, what were you going to use it for? And there are some things that have gone away. Like do you remember Live Journal?
No, like I do not.
Or even just the term blogging.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, so you could be like blogging, playing PlayStation, and listening to Taking Back Sunday, and you'd be like the ultimate 2000s,
Oh yeah, or going online and downloading things off of LimeWire illegally, Taking Back Sunday as it's coming off of LimeWire.
I'm so glad you brought up LimeWire.
Waiting for the feds to end up at your house because you didn't pay the $1 it cost to download it.
That was always the rumor too, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I was in college around that time, and I remember there was always like urban legends of like the kid who their computer got scanned, and then they found out you didn't pay for that download.
Oh yeah.
And LimeWire came after Napster, and Napster was like you would set a download and then come back later in the day and check on it, and it was still like not quite done.
Yep.
So that's the world of Taking Back Sunday.
That's for sure.
Do you think that any of that kind of what their audience was doing informed their music and the kind, maybe like the length of their songs, or how they, because you're looking at the vinyl of it. I would be curious to find out if they even produced many of these with the first introduction of this album, because were you listening to vinyl back then?
No, absolutely not. I was listening to CD players, a Discman that you walk around with a CD. Like that's
you'd burn a CD, right? Because you'd download it off the internet, burn it, and then you'd have it. And that was like, I remember the contraption, because the first car that I had didn't have anything. It had a radio, and I had to get this CD player that I velcroed onto the dashboard, and then had this adapter that I had to set it to the right channel on the FM dial, and I could listen to my CDs that way, and then I'd hit a bump and then it'd all be over. So that's this group, and so I guess that brings us to the modern day. Why do you think they put that out on vinyl 20 years later?
That's a great question. I would say just because, as we know, vinyl's making a comeback, and people are more interested in it, and just being able to have that vinyl that brings you back in time to Taking Back Sunday, which is like I've been looking at this vinyl for weeks and wanting to buy it. And it might just be the time to do it. But like thinking about listening to everything that I grew up on a vinyl is really interesting.
Because listening to vinyl listening to record players is a little bit more refined.
Yep.
You know, you can't. I know they made car record players, but they didn't catch on for obvious reasons. It's something you need to. When you're listening to a record on vinyl, it's a lot more of a deliberate action. It's either you're listening to it intently or it's on in the background, but it's not something you can just like carry around with you. You have to be in the room with it, and it's like now this album and its audience has joined all these other ones that you see up here.
Absolutely.
As being the part of that pantheon of recorded music that, maybe 20 years ago, you're like, what? This doesn't belong with Black Sabbath. This doesn't belong with Kiss. This doesn't belong with...
And now it's a whole nother world. Like, everyone is wanting to listen to what they're used to listening to on vinyl now.
Do you listen to modern music of the same variety?
Not really. I'm more of I know what I like to listen to, and I download it like on Spotify or whatever it is and listen to those same songs. I don't really do much like exploring of new kind of stuff.
I agree with you there, and I don't think that we're all that unique. I think there's a lot of people like us that were kind of like, we gathered the music that we wanted to listen to in our youth, and then we got set in our ways.
Absolutely.
And unless somebody can actually... tap back into that somehow. Like when I go to a concert and I, usually an opening act that I don't really know very well, if they throw in a cover song
absolutely
of a song that I do know, I'm like, now you got my attention. 100%. But otherwise, I'm just kind of like, all right.
Just waiting for the one that you came for.
When will you be done?
Yep, absolutely.
So, to put a stamp on this, the intended audience of Taking Back Sunday, where do you see this album 20 more years from now?
Oh, that's a great question.
We were talking before about how oldies, that expression has broadened to include things like the 80s, and it won't be long before we start hearing No Doubt on the oldies channel.
I have a fear that it won't be what it is or what it was, because I don't think that the younger generation will really understand or value what Taking Back Sunday offers / offered. I hope that's not the case, but I hope that in another 20 years it's something that people are still listening to and recognize that like this music is like from a different era that is so special to so many people.
And the early 2000s are an odd time period because it's... I don't know if you ever watched the show Portlandia.
No, I don't think I have.
Oh, it's so much fun. Fred Armisen is and Carrie, I forget her last name, but I'll go back. Anyway, it's a sketch comedy show set in Portland, Oregon, and they do such a great job of referencing pop culture and explaining things. And there's an episode where they're having a yard sale, and everything that they're selling is from the 2000s. And the mayor of the city, that they just call Mr. Mayor, he comes and buys it all for like 20 cents for everything. And then a week later, he opens up his Cafe Y2K. And they go in there, and it's like a Hard Rock Cafe kind of thing, but it's themed Y2K. There's like a Tom Brady jersey and like a, Lance Armstrong, Live Strong thing going on. And they kind of say it while they're like, this time period went by so fast that we didn't even have a chance to like take it in.
Yep,
it was like the 90s kind of spilled over. We got all excited about 2000 because it's a new,
new
millennium,
world.
new century, new world. And then before we knew it, it's 2009, 2010. We're like, oh, okay, now we're on to the next decade. And we didn't get to really, have it. So I think that's a great document.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of that era, because it's I'm sure it's not just straightforward rock music. They probably have a lot more other sounds involved into it.
Oh yeah, it's definitely something you'll have to listen. You'll have to on the way home.
On the way home, I'll definitely
go onto Spotify and look up Taking Back Sunday, because I think you'll enjoy what you hear.
I always surprise myself at how I am nostalgic for things I didn't even really get into. I used to not really like Smashing Pumpkins that much, the band or the activity, and and then like maybe 10 years ago, I remember a Smashing Pumpkins song came on the radio. And I was like turning it up, like that's such a.
Oh yeah.
Coincidentally, it's that song 1979. Which is its own nostalgia song for another time period that I didn't experience. I was born 2 years later. And it was just like, I think that's where we are now with this, so.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining me up here.
Yeah, thank you.
And hopefully
this
will
wonderful.
Encourage other people to join me as well. But are you going to go ahead and pull the trigger on this one? And
I haven't decided yet. I'm going to think about it.
Okay, well, maybe this one you can think about it more.
It might.
Thank you again, Skylor.
Well, thank you.
Have a great night.
You too.
This is Season 2 of the EPS podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Short episodes like this one, which are products of my EPS Podcast Live exhibits, have been coming out on Tuesdays this season, while longer episodes, deeper dives into subjects, are posted on Thursdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS podcast. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube and especially on Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.